Hi, my name is Sarah, and I'm an event planner at the Orange County Library System, but I am also a published author. In the writing community, there are a lot of phrases that get tossed around that can confuse newer writers. These are rules of writing that are more like guidelines or simply common advice. But as always, it's good to know the rules before you decide to break them. So I wanted to discuss 5 of these common writing rules and what exactly they mean. First is show, don't tell. A lot of newer writers start out by telling too much, which is why this is such common advice. Showing is a style of writing that allows the reader to experience the moment firsthand, whereas telling is more like hearing about it from someone else secondhand. So for example, you could say, Chelsea was worried about the hospital bill, and that would be telling. The reader doesn't see anything that Chelsea might be doing to indicate worrying. In order to show, instead, you could say something like, Chelsea paced the floor, her eyebrows drawing together as she read the hospital bill for the 3rd time. This way, the reader understands that Chelsea is worried without you having to actually say it, and they will usually feel it more viscerally. However, showing all the time and never telling is usually not very enjoyable to read either. It can become very tedious. But as I said earlier, many newer writers will tell too much and not show enough, which is why it is such common advice. To be more accurate, it should probably be show whenever you really want the reader to understand something or to feel something, and tell when you just need to get information out and move the scene forward. But that is not as catchy. To further understand this concept, I always recommend taking a book that you really enjoy and rereading it with an eye towards show versus tell, and take notes on what the author did in terms of show versus tell. The second writing rule is write what you know. This is another piece of advice that is commonly misconstrued. It doesn't mean that you can only write about the things, locations, and people that you have personally experienced, though that may be a good place to start for some new writers. If that were true, then we could all only write thinly veiled memoirs. It means that you, using aspects of story and characters that you personally deeply relate to, could help you tell a deeper story. It means that you can use your personal experiences and emotional truths to really breathe life into a story. So for example, you may not know what it's like to be a king's mage in a world where all of the magic comes from dragon bones, but you do know what it's like to be underappreciated at your job. The third writing rule we're going to talk about is kill your darlings. What this phrase means is that sometimes you need to eliminate particular elements of your book that you really love in order to make it a stronger book. If there is a character in your book that you really adore, but is not pulling his weight in the story, for example, you may have to cut him. If there is a page or two of beautiful prose that you are very proud of, but it slows the story down too much, you may need to cut some of it or split it up. It can often be very difficult because you may really like them and you may have worked really hard on them, but you know that your story is going to be stronger once you remove those elements. The fourth writing rule we're going to discuss is start with action. This is often given as advice on how to start a novel in an enticing way. Sometimes what they're really saying is don't start the story in a boring way. Even when starting with action is a good idea, this doesn't necessarily mean starting with a big action fight or chase scene. In fact, this can actually be a detriment to your opening if the reader doesn't care what happens in that scene. This is often criticized as action for the sake of action. Start with action is usually said in an attempt to avoid starting with a whole bunch of backstory or a lengthy internal monologue, but those actions don't have to be very big things. Those actions can actually be relatively small things. So for example, in my book, Keeping Her Secret, the story starts with the main character carrying her too heavy bag around her new summer camp looking for her cabin. The final writing rule that we're going to discuss is don't use passive voice. This is another one that is very common advice because it's something newer writers do a lot of the time without even realizing that they're doing it. We're going to have to get into some grammar for this one. A sentence in the passive voice makes the object of an action into the subject of the sentence. So, for example, the classic question, why did the chicken cross the road, becomes, why was the road crossed by the chicken? To go even further, some writers will remove the subject of the active version of the sentence. So, for example, Jim kicked the chair becomes, the chair was kicked. Sometimes this can be intentional. For example, whenever the narrator doesn't know who did the kicking, but most of the time it is unintentional. The tip that was shared with me when I first started writing was that if you can add by zombies to the end of the sentence, it probably needs to be rewritten to make it more active. The accidental use of passive voice can result in a loss of clarity and make it feel like the main character is not an active participant in their own story. This is why it's often a problem. However, using passive voice sometimes is a stylistic choice that can be quite useful if done intentionally. I hope I have helped you understand what these 5 writing rules mean and why they're so common. They're not so much rules as guidelines or places to start. Any of these rules can be broken to great effect, but it is better to understand why the advice is so prevalent before you decide to go against it.
Thank you for watching. To learn more about writing workshops and see more videos, visit ocls.info/Writers Corner. Orange County Library System is your place to learn, grow, connect.